It's 214 BCE, somewhere along a mountain ridge in what is now Inner Mongolia. You were one of roughly 300,000 soldiers under a general named Meng Tian, and your job today is the same as it was yesterday and the same as it will be tomorrow. Move earth. Not stone, not yet. Earth. You are packing dirt into a wooden frame, tamping it down with a heavy pole until it's hard as brink, then stripping the frame off and doing it again, one layer at a time, for a wall that will eventually stretch further than the distance from New York to Los Angeles and back, twice over. You do not know the phrase Great Wall of China. Nobody here does. As far as you know, you're building a border, a very, very long border, in a place cold enough at night to crack skin and hot enough by midday to blister it. And you have absolutely no idea that people 2,000 years from now will still be arguing about how anyone managed to do this at all, let alone why. Here's the number that gets thrown around: 13,000 miles. It sounds like a single object, a wall built once by one emperor in one heroic push, the way it gets described in a 5-minute travel video. That's the picture in your head, and it is almost completely wrong. The Great Wall isn't a wall. It's a filing cabinet. It's the accumulated, overlapping, occasionally contradictory work of at least 9 different dynasties spread across more than 2,000 years, starting with fragmented state walls in the 5th century BCE, unified for the first time under the Qin around 221 BCE, extended dramatically by the Han to guard the Silk Road, left to crumble for centuries afterward, and then rebuilt almost entirely from scratch by the Ming, whose brick and stone sections are the ones you've actually seen in photographs. When people say the Great Wall was built, they're compressing 2 millennia of separate, disconnected, sometimes centuries-apart construction projects into one tidy sentence. So today we're pulling that sentence apart. How do you actually build something this long? How do you feed the people building it? How many of them died doing it? And is the wall really the longest cemetery on Earth like the legend insists? And why, after all of that, did it repeatedly fail to stop the invasions it was built to stop? Let's go.
Move 1. It's not a wall, it's a network. Start with the terrain because the terrain is doing more of the work than the builders are. Roughly a quarter of the wall's total length isn't constructed at all. It's rivers, cliff faces, and mountain ridge lines that were simply incorporated as natural barriers, with actual masonry filling only the gaps between them. That's the first trick every dynasty reused. Never build what nature already built for you. Route the wall along a ridge and you get elevation, sight lines, and a slope your enemy has to climb under fire, all for free. So the wall isn't really 13,000 miles of stone and brick. It's 13,000 miles of border, of which the actual constructed sections are maybe 70%, stitched between escarpments, dry riverbeds, and slopes too steep for cavalry to climb, with trenches and moats filling in a smaller remainder where neither nature nor masonry was practical. Move 2. The material problem, and why it changes completely depending on which century and which stretch of frontier you're standing in. The earliest walls, the Qin-era sections up in what's now Inner Mongolia, were built almost entirely from rammed earth, exactly like the scene we opened on. Layer soil into a wooden frame, compress it until it's dense enough to ring when you knock on it, strip the frame, repeat, for months, for years. It's fast, it's cheap, and it uses whatever dirt is already under your feet, which matters enormously when you're building across a desert with no stone quarries within 100 miles. The problem is that rammed earth erodes. 2,000 years of wind, frost, and rain have reduced most of the original Qin wall to low, grassy mounds you could walk straight past without recognizing what you were looking at. When the Ming dynasty took over wall building in the 1400s, they had a different problem entirely. They weren't defending an empty frontier anymore. They were defending Beijing itself, their new capital, against a resurgent Mongol threat sitting uncomfortably close to the throne. Rammed earth wasn't going to cut it, so Ming engineers switched to fired brick and dressed stone, quarried locally wherever possible, and hauled up mountainsides on foot, by mule, sometimes by goat, because a fully loaded cart is worthless on a 45-degree slope, and there was no alternative. And for the mortar holding those bricks together, Ming builders used something that sounds like a joke and isn't: sticky rice. They boiled glutinous rice into a thick paste and mixed it with slaked lime, and the starch in that rice, a compound called amylopectin, bonded chemically with the lime to create a mortar stronger and more water-resistant than plain lime mortar could ever be on its own. Modern researchers only confirmed the chemistry behind this in 2010, using electron microscopy to work out why Ming-era mortar was outperforming anything else from the period.
The people who invented it in the 1400s didn't need the chemistry. They just knew it worked, closely guarded it as something close to a trade secret among master masons, and it worked well enough that weeds still can't get a foothold in the joints of some Ming sections 600 years later. Some later restoration crews, working with modern industrial mortar, have struggled to match the durability of a recipe built out of dinner.
Move 3. Who actually built it and how many of them didn't walk away? Here's where the myth needs sorting, because the truth is worse than the legend in some ways and better in others. There are really 3 labor pools that show up again and again across every dynasty: soldiers, conscripted civilians, and convicts. Under the Qin, General Meng Tian's original force was several 100,000 soldiers, reinforced with several 100,000 more conscripted laborers pulled from across the newly unified country. And at the peak of Qin construction, some estimates put the combined workforce over 1 million men at once, on a single project, in a country that had only just finished being stitched together from warring states. Later dynasties followed the same playbook at similar or greater scale. The Northern Qi dynasty in the 500s conscripted close to 2 million people for a single stretch running from Shaokou to Hangzhou. The Sui dynasty a few decades later ran a project so large it exhausted the available male labor pool entirely and began conscripting women as well, a detail that tends to get left out of the postcard version of this story. Convicts sentenced to hard labor were shipped to the frontier under Qin law to serve 4-year sentences, marked with shaved heads and shackles so they couldn't blend back into a town if they slipped away, working patrol duty by day and construction by night. And if a convict died before his sentence was up, a member of his own family was legally required to travel to the frontier and take his place. Read that again. The state didn't just lose a laborer when someone died out there, it replaced him from the man's own household, automatically, by statute, with no appeal. Now the myth. You've probably heard some version of it, that the dead were ground up and mixed into the mortar, or bricked directly into the wall itself, and that it's functionally the longest graveyard on the planet. The mortar version is almost certainly false. Mixing human remains into rammed earth or brick mortar would have weakened the structure rather than strengthened it, and there's no material or archaeological evidence supporting it anywhere along the wall's length. But the underlying claim, that the death toll was genuinely staggering, is not an exaggeration dreamed up by tour guides. Historians place the death toll across the wall's full construction history somewhere in the hundreds of thousands, and a poem written during the Han Dynasty, only a few decades after the Qin wall went up, already carries a warning baked into it, roughly translated as, "If a son is born to you, don't bother raising him. Look at what happened to the men who built the wall." That's not a modern historian's grim interpretation layered on after the fact. That's a poem written by people who were alive close enough to the event to still be furious about it. Move 4, the part nobody puts in the postcard. Keeping the wall fed, staffed, and talking to itself across a distance too vast for any single messenger. A wall that long is useless if it's silent. The Ming solution was a chain of beacon towers, spaced at regular intervals along the entire length, each one staffed by a small garrison whose entire job, day and night, was watching the horizon and nothing else. When an enemy force was spotted, the tower lit a signal, smoke by day, fire by night, and the next tower down the line saw it and lit its own within minutes, and the one after that did the same, relaying a warning across hundreds of miles faster than any horse could physically carry it. Some tower networks reported varied the number of smoke plumes to encode roughly how large the approaching force was, a crude but functional form of coded messaging. That's not decoration. That's a communication system built more than 1,000 years before the telegraph, running entirely on fire, smoke, and a chain of exhausted men staring at an empty horizon in shifts. And behind the beacon towers sat the unglamorous machinery that made any of this survivable long-term. Garrison towns strung along the wall's interior side, granaries stocked to feed troops through winters when the frontier was cut off by snow, and entire settlements that existed for no reason other than to fire bricks, quarry stone, and move supplies uphill. Building the wall wasn't one project. It was a permanent, standing bureaucracy that had to move food, water, and building material across mountains and deserts continuously for centuries, without the whole operation collapsing under its own logistics. That bureaucracy is arguably the more impressive achievement than the wall itself. Anybody can stack bricks if you hand them enough bricks. Getting the bricks there in the first place, across a ridge too steep for a cart, in a country the size of a continent, using nothing but human muscle and pack animals. That's the actual engineering problem, and it's the one nobody photographs. The twist. Here's where this whole story turns over. We've been treating the wall as a defensive triumph, the thing that kept the empire safe. It wasn't. Not reliably. Depending on which dynasty and which decade you look at, the wall repeatedly failed to do the one thing it was supposedly built for.
Mongol forces breached fortified sections more than once across the centuries. The most consequential case, in the 1600s, a Ming general stationed at a critical mountain pass simply opened the gates and let an invading Manchu army through, because he judged an internal rebellion tearing through China's interior to be the bigger and more immediate threat. That single decision helped end the Ming dynasty entirely and installed the Qing dynasty in its place for the next 2.5 centuries. 2,000 years of continuous brutal construction, and the wall's single most consequential moment in the historical record is a gate that somebody with other priorities chose to open. Which raises the obvious question: if it didn't reliably keep people out, what was it actually for? The honest answer is that keep the invaders out was only ever one job among several, and maybe not even the primary one. The wall controlled who and what crossed the frontier, which meant it functioned as a customs checkpoint stretched across a continent, letting the state tax and monitor trade moving along the Silk Road in both directions. It let a government move its own troops quickly along the wall's length, using the structure itself as an elevated road through hostile terrain. And it was a signal, a physical, unmissable line drawn across the landscape that told nomadic groups to the north and settled populations to the south exactly where one world ended and the other began, whether or not anyone could actually stop you from crossing it. In some dynasties, like the Tang, the ruling family had enough diplomatic leverage and enough skill in the exact style of mobile warfare their northern neighbors practiced that they built almost no new wall at all, because thousands of miles of masonry is what you fall back on when negotiation and cavalry aren't working, not a first resort for a confident government. The wall wasn't the strategy. It was the backup plan that outlived every strategy that came before it. And one more myth, since we're already clearing them out. You've probably heard that the Great Wall is the only man-made structure visible from space, or even from the moon. It isn't. That claim dates back to 1923, decades before anyone had actually been to space to check it, and every astronaut who's since been asked about it, including the first Chinese astronaut to reach orbit in 2003, has confirmed the same thing. From orbit, with the naked eye, the wall is nearly invisible, because for most of its length, it's only about 20 feet wide, roughly the width of a 2-lane road, snaking across a landscape that's hundreds of miles wide in every direction. Highways and airport runways are, in practice, easier to spot from orbit than the wall is. The single most famous structure on Earth, and the one fact everyone thinks they already know about it, turns out to be the part that isn't true.
So here's what actually happened. Not one wall, one emperor, one act of collective will. 9 dynasties, over 2,000 years. Rammed earth in the deserts of the north, giving way to fired brick and sticky rice mortar on the mountains guarding the capital. A communications network built out of smoke and fire, relaying warnings faster than a horse could ride. Millions of soldiers, conscripts, and convicts, some of them legally replaced by a family member the moment they died on the job. A wall that failed militarily more than once, and mattered anyway because its real function was never purely defense. It was drawing a line across a continent and making a government's reach visible from any direction you approached it, whether you could actually cross that line or not. Back on that ridge in 214 BCE, the man tamping down his layer of earth has no way of knowing any of this. He doesn't know about the Ming brick that will one day sit on top of his work 18 centuries later, or the sticky rice mortar, or the beacon towers, or the gate that gets opened 1,600 years after his death by a general with different priorities than the ones this wall was built to serve. He just knows the frame needs another layer of earth before the light goes, and that tomorrow, whether he's a soldier, a conscript, or a convict working off a sentence, he'll do it again. So would you take that deal? A permanent posting on a frontier that never really stops the people it's meant to stop? A 4-year sentence if you're unlucky enough to be a convict? And the knowledge that if you die out there, your own family legally owes the state your replacement? Let me know in the comments. Until then, see you soon.